The morning sun cast long shadows across the presidential palace in Ouagadougou as Captain Ibrahim Traore stood before a massive map of Burkina Faso. Red pins marked areas where his people were struggling. Drought-stricken villages, failed harvests, and communities on the brink of starvation. At just 34 years old, the young military leader who had taken power in a coup faced challenges that would test even the most experienced politician. Burkina Faso was dying slowly. The Sahel region, once green and fertile, had transformed into an unforgiving landscape of sand and scrubland. Climate change had turned reliable rain patterns into a distant memory. Farmers who had worked their land for generations now watched helplessly as their crops withered under the relentless sun. Traditional cattle, the backbone of rural wealth, were dropping dead from heat and lack of water. The economic statistics painted a grim picture that kept Traore awake at night. Over 40% of the population lived below the poverty line. Rural communities, which made up 70% of the country, were abandoning their ancestral homes in search of survival. Young people were fleeing to overcrowded cities or attempting dangerous journeys to Europe, leaving behind elderly parents and empty villages. International aid organizations had tried various solutions over the years. They brought modern farming techniques, drought-resistant crops, and water pumps. Some projects showed promise initially, but most failed when funding dried up, or when the harsh reality of the Sahel's changing climate proved too powerful for conventional solutions. The people needed something different, something that could thrive in conditions that were defeating everything else. Traore had grown up in rural Burkina Faso and understood the deep connection between his people and their livestock. He remembered stories his grandfather told about the great camel caravans that once crossed the Sahara, bringing wealth and prosperity to West African kingdoms. These magnificent animals had been the foundation of trade routes that made empires rich. They could travel for days without water, carry heavy loads across impossible terrain, and survive in conditions that killed other animals. One evening, while reviewing reports about livestock mortality rates, an idea began forming in Traore's mind. What if the solution to Burkina Faso's crisis lay not in modern technology or foreign aid, but in embracing an ancient wisdom? What if millions of camels could transform his struggling nation into a powerhouse of the Sahel? The more he researched, the more convinced he became. Camels produced nutritious milk that could feed malnourished children. Their meat was lean and protein-rich, perfect for a population facing food insecurity. Their leather could be crafted into goods for export, creating jobs and bringing foreign currency into the country. Most importantly, camels thrived in exactly the conditions that were destroying traditional farming and livestock. Traore called his closest advisors for a midnight meeting. The presidential conference room fell silent as he outlined his vision. Some of his ministers looked skeptical, others intrigued. The Minister of Agriculture shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly thinking about the practical challenges. The finance minister was already calculating costs in his head. The plan was ambitious beyond anything Burkina Faso had ever attempted. Traore wanted to import millions of camels from across Africa and the Middle East. He envisioned vast camel ranches stretching across the northern regions, employing thousands of people as herders, veterinarians, and processing workers. Mobile slaughterhouses would travel from ranch to ranch, ensuring fresh meat reached urban markets. Milk processing facilities would turn camel milk into cheese, yogurt, and powdered products for export. But this was more than just livestock farming. Traore saw an opportunity to revolutionize Burkina Faso's entire economy. Camel racing could become a tourist attraction, drawing visitors from across West Africa. Camel leather workshops could train young artisans, creating a new generation of skilled craftspeople. The animals themselves could become symbols of national pride and resilience. The room buzzed with whispered conversations as ministers considered the implications. Never before had a West African nation attempted to base its economic recovery on camels. The scale Traore was proposing, millions of animals, would make Burkina Faso the largest camel-owning country in the world outside of Somalia and Sudan. Critics would undoubtedly call it crazy. International development experts would question the wisdom of such an unconventional approach. But Traore had seen too many foreign-designed programs fail to solve his country's problems. His people needed solutions that worked with their environment, not against it. As dawn broke over Ouagadougou, Traore made his decision. He would stake his presidency and his country's future on the most unlikely of animals. The great camel experiment was about to begin, and the entire world would watch to see if a young African leader's wild dream could actually save a nation. The announcement came on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon that would forever change how the world viewed Burkina Faso. President Ibrahim Traore stepped up to the podium at the national television station, his military uniform crisp despite the heat. Behind him, a large screen displayed images of camels against the backdrop of the Sahel's golden landscape. News of the Camel Initiative spread like wildfire across social media and international news networks. Headlines ranged from curious to mocking. African Leaders' Camel Crusade read one international newspaper. From coups to camels, Burkina Faso's unusual economic plan declared another. But in the villages and towns across Burkina Faso, people gathered around radios and shared phones to listen with growing excitement. Traore had spent weeks preparing for this moment, knowing that his announcement would face ridicule from skeptics. He began his speech by acknowledging the suffering of his people. Farmers in the audience nodded as he described failed harvests and dying cattle. Urban dwellers recognized his description of young people leaving for uncertain futures abroad. Then, with characteristic boldness, he unveiled his solution. The numbers were staggering. Burkina Faso would acquire 5 million camels over the next 5 years. The first phase would bring in 500,000 animals from Sudan, Somalia, Chad, and Mauritania. Massive ranches would be established in the northern provinces, where the climate most closely resembled the animals' natural habitat. The government would hire international experts in camel husbandry and send hundreds of young Burkinabe to study camel management in countries like UAE and Australia. International reactions were swift and divided. Development economists questioned whether a country struggling with basic infrastructure could handle such a massive livestock operation. Some African leaders privately wondered if their young colleague had lost his mind. However, a few respected voices offered cautious support. A prominent Kenyan economist noted that camels had sustained nomadic communities for millennia and might indeed offer solutions to climate change challenges. The logistics alone seemed overwhelming to many observers. How would Burkina Faso transport millions of camels across international borders? Where would they find enough veterinarians to keep the animals healthy? How would they prevent the camels from wandering off into neighboring countries? These questions dominated discussion panels on international news channels, but Traore had done his homework. His research team had identified experienced camel traders in Sudan who controlled herds numbering in the hundreds of thousands. These traders, many from families that had been in the business for generations, possessed knowledge that no university, textbook could provide. They understood bloodlines, breeding patterns, and the subtle signs that indicated a camel's health and temperament. The financial aspects of the plan were equally ambitious. Traore announced that Burkina Faso would spend nearly $2 billion over 5 years on the camel program. This represented a massive portion of the national budget, money that would come from redirecting funds previously allocated to less successful development projects. Additionally, the government would seek loans from friendly nations and international development banks. Opposition politicians immediately attacked the plan as reckless spending on an unproven scheme. They argued that the money would be better spent on schools, hospitals, and roads. Some accused Traore of pursuing a vanity project that would bankrupt the nation. Protests organized by opposition groups attracted hundreds of supporters who chanted slogans about responsible governance. However, in rural areas, the response was dramatically different. Village elders who remembered stories of camel caravans spoke with enthusiasm about the potential for their communities to prosper again. Young men who had been preparing to migrate to cities began considering careers as camel herders. Women's cooperatives started discussing how they might process camel milk into traditional products. The plan also included significant social components that won support from unexpected quarters. Traore announced that 30% of camel herding positions would be reserved for women, challenging traditional gender roles in livestock management. Educational programs would teach children about camel care, creating a new generation of experts. Veterans of Burkina Faso's military would receive priority in hiring for ranch security positions. International camel experts began arriving in Ouagadougou within weeks of the announcement. Dr. Razak Al-Mansouri, a renowned camel specialist from the UAE, agreed to serve as the program's chief technical advisor. His presence lent credibility to what many had dismissed as an impossible dream. Australian ranchers who managed large camel populations offered to train Burkinabe workers in modern herding techniques. The most challenging aspect of the plan involved convincing neighboring countries to cooperate. Camels don't recognize national borders, and without regional coordination, the animals could easily wander into Mali, Niger, or Ghana. Traore embarked on a diplomatic tour, meeting with regional leaders to negotiate agreements for managing cross-border camel movements. As the weeks passed, the initial mockery began giving way to cautious interest. Agricultural experts noted that camels required less water than cattle and could browse on desert plants that other livestock ignored. Environmental scientists pointed out that camel grazing could actually help restore degraded land in the Sahel. Economic analysts began calculating the potential revenue from camel meat, milk, and leather exports. The world watched with fascination as Burkina Faso prepared for the largest camel importation in modern African history. Traore's bold gamble was about to face its first real test. The massive convoy stretched for miles across the Sahara, creating clouds of dust visible from satellites. 15,000 camels, the first wave of Traore's ambitious plan, were making their way from Sudan to Burkina Faso in what would become known as the Great Camel March. The journey, carefully coordinated over 6 months, represented the largest movement of camels in modern African history. Leading the convoy was Mahmoud Hassan, a legendary Sudanese camel trader whose family had been moving animals across the desert for over 2 centuries. His weathered hands gripped the reins of his favorite riding camel as he surveyed the endless line of animals behind him. Each camel represented hope for Burkina Faso's struggling people, but Hassan knew the challenges that lay ahead. The logistics were mind-boggling. Veterinary teams had spent weeks examining every animal, checking for diseases and ensuring they were strong enough for the long journey. Special permits had been negotiated with Chad and Niger to allow passage through their territories. Water stations were established every 50 kilometers along the route, each requiring coordination between multiple governments and international agencies. Back in Burkina Faso, construction crews worked around the clock to prepare the first mega ranch. Located in Sahel province, the facility would eventually house 100,000 camels on an area larger than some small countries. Solar-powered water systems pumped precious groundwater into massive storage tanks, shade structures designed by engineers from Israel who had experience with desert conditions, provided relief from the scorching sun. The human element was equally challenging. Traore's government had recruited camel herders from across the Sahel region, offering salaries that were generous by local standards. Many were traditional nomads who had never worked for wages before. Cultural mediators helped bridge the gap between government officials and these proud, independent people who viewed camels as partners rather than mere livestock. Dr. Fatima Ouedraogo, Burkina Faso's first female camel veterinarian, had returned from specialized training in Australia just days before the convoy's arrival. She established mobile veterinary units that could respond quickly to any health crisis among the animals. Her team included young Burkinabe graduates who had never seen a camel before but were eager to learn from the Sudanese experts. International media followed the convoy's progress with growing fascination. Drone footage showed the seemingly endless line of camels moving across landscapes that looked like another planet. Social media users shared videos of the animals gracefully navigating sand dunes and rocky terrain that would challenge any vehicle. Suddenly, Burkina Faso was receiving more positive international attention than it had in decades. However, the journey was not without problems. A sandstorm near the Chad-Niger border scattered part of the herd, requiring 3 days to gather the animals again. Several camels fell ill from contaminated water at one stopping point, forcing the convoy to detour to a different route. Political tensions between Chad and Niger briefly threatened to close borders, potentially stranding thousands of animals in the desert. The most serious crisis occurred when armed bandits attempted to steal several hundred camels. The convoy's security team, composed of former military personnel from multiple countries, managed to repel the attack, but not before several animals were killed. International news coverage of the incident led to increased security support from the African Union and additional funding for protective measures. As the convoy approached Burkina Faso's border, thousands of people gathered to witness this historic moment. Children who had never seen a camel stared in wonder at the massive animals. Elderly residents wept, remembering stories their grandparents had told about the great camel caravans of centuries past. Local musicians composed songs celebrating the animals' arrival. The border crossing itself took 3 full days. Each camel had to be individually documented, vaccinated, and assigned an identification number. Government officials from both Sudan and Burkina Faso worked alongside international observers to ensure proper protocols were followed. The paperwork alone filled several trucks. Traore himself traveled to the border to welcome the first camels onto Burkinabe soil. Wearing traditional robes instead of his usual military uniform, he rode a magnificent white camel provided by the Sudanese delegation. The symbolism was powerful, a young African leader literally riding into his country's future on the back of an ancient desert survivor. The economic impact was already becoming visible. Hotels and border towns were fully booked with journalists, government officials, and curious visitors. Local vendors sold camel-themed merchandise to tourists. Restaurants experimented with camel meat dishes, drawing long lines of adventurous diners. But challenges remained enormous. The camels needed time to adjust to their new environment. Some animals, stressed by the long journey, refused to eat the local vegetation. Others showed signs of depression, a condition that camel experts recognized but many government officials had never heard of. The learning curve for local herders was steeper than anyone had anticipated. International development organizations watched the experiment with mixed emotions. Some aid workers worried that focusing resources on camels would divert attention from pressing needs like education and healthcare. Others began quietly studying the program, wondering if similar approaches might work in other climate-stressed regions of Africa. As the last camels crossed into Burkina Faso, Hassan reflected on what he had witnessed. Never before had he delivered animals to a country with such grand ambitions for them. The success or failure of this experiment would determine whether other nations might follow Burkina Faso's example. The desert had seen many empires rise and fall, but perhaps it was about to witness something entirely new. 6 months after the first camels arrived, the reality of managing hundreds of thousands of desert animals was proving more complex than even the most detailed planning had anticipated. President Traore stood in the control room of the Central Camel Management Center, watching digital displays that tracked the location, health, and breeding status of every animal in the national herd through GPS collars and satellite monitoring. The technology was impressive, but the human stories were more compelling. Amadou Sawadogo, a former cattle herder from Yatenga province, had become one of the program's most successful camel managers. His natural understanding of animal behavior, combined with intensive training from Sudanese experts, made him invaluable in managing herds that numbered in the thousands. His monthly salary was now 5 times what he had earned from his small cattle herd, allowing him to send his children to university in the capital. However, not all adaptations were smooth. Traditional Fulani herders, proud people who had managed cattle for generations, struggled with the different temperament and needs of camels. Camels were more independent than cattle, often wandering far from water sources and requiring different grazing patterns. Some experienced herders quit in frustration, while others persevered and eventually became the program's most knowledgeable workers. The veterinary challenges were unlike anything Burkina Faso had faced before. Dr. Ouedraogo's team dealt with diseases they had only read about in textbooks, Camel pox outbreaks required quarantine procedures that affected entire ranches. Nutritional deficiencies caused by unfamiliar local plants led to mysterious illnesses that stumped even international experts. The learning curve was steep and expensive, with veterinary costs running far higher than initial projections. Meanwhile, the economic benefits were beginning to emerge in unexpected ways. The city of Garam Garam, traditionally a dusty trading post, had transformed into a bustling hub of camel-related commerce. New businesses sprouted weekly: specialized veterinary clinics, camel equipment manufacturers, and processing facilities for camel products. Real estate prices soared as entrepreneurs and workers flocked to the region. Camel milk production exceeded all expectations. The animals, once adjusted to their new environment, produced rich, creamy milk with unique nutritional properties. Local women formed cooperatives to process the milk into cheese, yogurt, and even ice cream. An enterprising group in Dori developed a camel milk soap that became popular with urban customers seeking exotic beauty products. International buyers began taking serious interest in Burkina Faso's camel products. Dubai-based importers signed contracts for premium camel meat, which commanded high prices in Middle Eastern markets. European health food companies discovered that camel milk was naturally lower in fat than cow milk and contained unique antibodies. Suddenly, products labeled "Made in Burkina Faso" were appearing in upscale grocery stores in Paris and London. The program also created unexpected diplomatic opportunities. When the UAE's Crown Prince visited to inspect camel racing facilities being built outside Ouagadougou, he announced a $50 million investment in camel breeding research. Saudi Arabian companies expressed interest in establishing leather processing plants that would export finished goods across West Africa. However, environmental concerns began emerging. The massive herds were changing vegetation patterns in ways that scientists were still trying to understand. Some areas showed signs of overgrazing, while others seemed to be recovering from decades of drought damage. Environmental monitoring stations tracked changes in soil composition and plant diversity, generating data that would take years to fully analyze. Social tensions also arose in some communities. Traditional farming families who had lost their land to camel ranches felt displaced and resentful. Young people who had expected to inherit family farms found themselves working as hired hands on government facilities. Compensation programs helped some families, but others remained bitter about the changes transforming their ancestral lands. The most visible success story was the transformation of rural women's roles. Contrary to traditional expectations, women proved exceptionally skilled at camel management. Their patience and attention to detail made them excellent at monitoring animal health and managing breeding programs. Fatou Traore, a young woman from a remote village, became the country's first female camel ranch supervisor, overseeing a facility with 30,000 animals. Educational programs were producing unexpected results. Children who had been failing in traditional subjects excelled when learning about camel biology and management. Rural schools integrated camel studies into their curricula, teaching everything from basic animal care to advanced genetics. University programs attracted students from across West Africa who wanted to study in the world's most ambitious camel management program. The racing aspect of the program generated enormous excitement. Professional jockeys from the UAE and Australia arrived to train young Burkinabe riders. The first national camel racing championship drew spectators from across the region, with betting pools reaching unprecedented levels. Television broadcasts of the races attracted viewers throughout Africa, generating tourism revenue and international recognition. Quality control became a major focus as production scaled up. Government inspectors ensured that camel meat met international health standards. Milk processing facilities implemented strict hygiene protocols. Leather tanning operations adopted environmental safeguards to prevent pollution. The reputation of Burkina Faso's camel products in international markets depended on maintaining these high standards. As the first year of the program concluded, initial results were mixed but encouraging. Unemployment in rural areas had dropped significantly. Export revenues were climbing steadily. International development organizations began studying the program as a potential model for other climate-stressed regions. However, the ultimate test lay ahead. Could the program sustain its early success and truly transform Burkina Faso's economy? Or would it prove to be an expensive experiment that eventually failed like so many development projects before it? 2 years into the Great Camel Experiment, Burkina Faso faced its most severe test yet. A drought that meteorologists called the worst in 50 years struck the Sahel region, turning already challenging conditions into a desperate fight for survival. While neighboring countries watched their traditional livestock die by the thousands, Burkina Faso's camels demonstrated why Traore had bet his presidency on these remarkable animals. The crisis began in March when seasonal rains failed to arrive. Across the entire Sahel belt, Mali, Niger, and Chad declared states of emergency as cattle herds collapsed and farmers abandoned their withered crops. International aid organizations prepared for another humanitarian disaster, dusting off emergency protocols they had used too many times before. But in Burkina Faso, something different was happening. Dr. Ahmed Kone, the program's chief range management specialist, watched from a helicopter as vast herds of camels moved across landscapes that looked completely barren. To untrained eyes, where other animals would have died, the camels were actually thriving. Their unique digestive systems allowed them to extract nutrients from thorny bushes and dried grasses that other livestock couldn't even eat. Their ability to go weeks without water meant they could graze in areas far from any water source. The economic impact was immediate and dramatic. While cattle prices collapsed across West Africa, demand for Burkina Faso's camel products soared. Countries that had ignored the camel program now sent urgent delegations to study how they might replicate it. Nigeria, facing massive livestock losses, signed emergency contracts to import camel breeding stock. Ghana's government announced plans to establish its own camel ranches in the northern regions. International media coverage transformed from skeptical curiosity to genuine amazement. CNN ran a documentary titled The Camel Miracle that showed Burkinabe herders calmly managing their animals, while farmers in neighboring countries faced devastation. The BBC featured interviews with families whose lives had been transformed from poverty to prosperity through camel-related jobs. Social media filled with images contrasting dying cattle in other countries with healthy camel herds in Burkina Faso. The human stories were the most compelling part of the narrative. Salif Ouedraogo, whose family had faced starvation during previous droughts, now managed a camel milk processing facility that employed 200 people. His daughter, studying veterinary medicine in Morocco, planned to return and establish the country's first specialized camel hospital. The transformation of individual families reflected the broader changes occurring across the nation. However, success brought new challenges. The rapid expansion of camel populations strained water resources in ways that planners had not fully anticipated. Deep wells that had sustained small communities for centuries were being depleted by massive herds. The government launched an emergency water infrastructure program, drilling hundreds of new boreholes and installing solar-powered pumping systems across the northern provinces. Environmental scientists raised concerns about the long-term impact of such large camel populations. While the animals were clearly well adapted to drought conditions, their concentrated presence was changing ecosystem dynamics in unpredictable ways. Some plant species that had survived decades of cattle grazing were disappearing under camel browsing pressure. Other areas showed surprising recovery as camels' different grazing patterns allowed new vegetation to emerge. The success also attracted unwanted attention from criminal organizations. Camel rustling became a serious problem, as organized gangs realized that a single high-quality breeding male could be worth more than a luxury car. The government responded by creating specialized anti-rustling units staffed by former military personnel who used drones and satellite tracking to protect the valuable herds. Regional tensions emerged as Burkina Faso's camel wealth became a source of envy and resentment among neighboring countries. Some politicians in Mali accused Traore of hoarding resources that should be shared across the Sahel. Niger's government complained that Burkina Faso's success made their own drought response look inadequate. Diplomatic meetings were required to prevent the camel program from becoming a source of regional conflict. The educational component of the program produced remarkable results during the drought. Young people who might have joined the exodus to cities or Europe instead found meaningful careers in camel management. Rural schools that had been closing due to population decline were now expanding to accommodate children whose families had returned to work on camel ranches. The University of Ouagadougou launched Africa's first graduate program in camel science, attracting students from across the continent. Women's roles continued to evolve in ways that surprised traditional communities. Female camel herders proved exceptionally skilled at managing animals during stressful conditions like drought. Their calm presence seemed to have a positive effect on nervous or aggressive camels. Several women became ranch supervisors, positions that carried significant authority and respect in rural communities where women had traditionally held little economic power. The racing and tourism aspects of the program flourished even during the drought. International visitors came specifically to witness how Burkina Faso was managing the crisis so successfully. Camel racing events became celebrations of resilience rather than mere entertainment. Foreign journalists who came to document drought response found themselves writing about innovation and hope instead of suffering and despair. Quality improvements in camel products continued despite the challenging conditions. Burkina Faso's camel cheese won international awards at food competitions in Europe. Camel leather goods, crafted by artisans who had mastered techniques learned from Moroccan masters, appeared in high-end boutiques in New York and Tokyo. The Halmarind, made in Burkina Faso label became associated with quality and sustainability, rather than poverty and underdevelopment. As the drought entered its second year, Traore reflected on how his risky gamble had not only succeeded, but had positioned Burkina Faso as a model for climate adaptation across Africa. However, he also understood that the program's long-term success would depend on managing growth sustainably and ensuring that the benefits reached all segments of society. The greatest challenges still lay ahead. 5 years after the first camels crossed into Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traore stood before the United Nations General Assembly in New York, no longer the young military leader who had seized power in a coup, but a respected statesman, whose radical experiment had become a blueprint for climate adaptation across the developing world. Behind him, a massive screen displayed satellite images showing the green transformation of what had once been barren desert in his homeland. The numbers spoke for themselves. Burkina Faso now hosted over 3 million camels, making it the third largest camel population in the world. The animals had generated over $4 billion in economic activity, transforming the country from one of the world's poorest to a middle-income nation. Unemployment had dropped from 40% to less than 10%. Most remarkably, the country that had once depended on food aid was now exporting agricultural products across West Africa. The transformation was visible from space. NASA satellite imagery showed dramatic changes in vegetation patterns across northern Burkina Faso. Areas that had been bare sand for decades now showed green patches where camel grazing had allowed drought-resistant plants to recover. Scientists studying the phenomenon discovered that camels' unique digestive systems actually improved soil quality through their waste, creating conditions that allowed native vegetation to return. Dr. Fatima Ouedraogo, now the world's leading expert in tropical camel medicine, had just returned from a conference in Australia, where delegates from 23 countries discussed implementing similar programs. Requests for technical assistance came from as far away as Mongolia and Peru. The small veterinary clinic she had started with a handful of graduates had grown into an international training center that attracted students from 6 continents. The human impact was equally dramatic. Families that had lived in mud huts 5 years earlier now occupied modern homes with solar electricity and running water. Children who would have become child laborers or street vendors were attending universities. The program had created an entirely new middle class in rural areas, reversing decades of urban migration as people moved back to the countryside to participate in the camel economy. Success had brought unexpected challenges. Managing such rapid economic growth required sophisticated planning that strained government capacity. New roads, schools, and hospitals had to be built quickly to serve expanding communities. The banking system needed upgrading to handle increased commerce. Corruption risks emerged as massive amounts of money flowed through previously impoverished regions. International recognition validated Traore's vision, but also created new pressures. Time magazine named him Person of the Year, describing him as the leader who proved that indigenous wisdom could solve modern problems. The World Bank offered a $1 billion loan to expand the program to other countries. However, Traore remained focused on ensuring that Burkina Faso's success was sustainable, rather than spectacular but temporary. Environmental monitoring revealed both positive and concerning trends. While degraded areas were recovering, the concentration of millions of camels was creating new environmental pressures. Water table levels dropped in some regions despite improved conservation measures. The government implemented strict carrying capacity limits for each ranch and invested heavily in water recycling and renewable energy systems to reduce environmental impact. The social changes were perhaps the most profound. Traditional gender roles had been completely transformed in camel-raising communities. Women held positions of authority that would have been unimaginable 5 years earlier. Young people who had expected to migrate to Europe were instead becoming entrepreneurs in their home villages. Elder councils that had resisted change were now actively promoting the program after witnessing its benefits. Cultural impacts extended far beyond economics. Burkina Faso's music, art, and literature increasingly celebrated themes of resilience and adaptation. The annual Camel Festival in Goram Goram attracted visitors from around the world, showcasing traditional crafts alongside modern innovations. Young musicians composed songs about the transformation of their homeland, creating a new genre that blended traditional African rhythms with themes of technological progress. Educational outcomes exceeded all expectations. Literacy rates in rural areas increased dramatically as parents recognized the connection between education and economic opportunity in the new economy. The University of Ouagadougou's Camel Research Program attracted international students and faculty, making Burkina Faso an unlikely center of academic excellence. Children who grew up around camels developed intuitive understanding of desert ecology that impressed visiting scientists. The program's influence spread far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Chad launched its own camel initiative with technical assistance from Burkinabe experts. Mauritania expanded its traditional camel industry using modern management techniques developed in Burkina Faso. Even countries outside Africa began exploring how the principles behind the program might apply to their own climate challenges. Critics who had initially dismissed the program as impossible now studied it as a model of successful development policy. Academic papers analyzed how Traore had managed to implement such a complex program despite limited resources and institutional capacity. Development economists revised their theories about economic transformation in least developed countries. PTR, racing and tourism components became significant industries in their own right. Professional camel racing leagues operated across West Africa, with Burkina Faso hosting championship events that attracted international television audiences. Ecotourism brought visitors who wanted to experience the remarkable transformation of the Sahel landscape. Hotels, restaurants, and tour operators created thousands of additional jobs. As Traore concluded his address to the United Nations, delegates from around the world rose in sustained applause. His closing words resonated beyond the assembly hall. We proved that the solutions to tomorrow's challenges might be found in yesterday's wisdom. When the world said our dreams were impossible, we chose to make the impossible inevitable. The young leader who had once stood before a map covered with red pins marking areas of suffering now presided over a nation transformed. The Great Camel experiment had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations, proving that bold leadership, ancient wisdom, and modern innovation could create miracles even in the world's most challenging environments. Burkina Faso had not just survived, it had shown the world a new model for thriving in an era of climate change.